Welcome everyone. Thanks for leaving your homes and putting down the phones, getting away from a screen and coming for a deeper conversation on a Monday evening. And I'm Alex Sloan. Good on the National Library for hosting events like this. Aren't we lucky and privileged to live in Canberra? And speaking of privilege, that's what it's like for me to live in a country which boasts members of the oldest continuous culture in the world. My daughter Zoe is currently a university student based in Melbourne, and as part of her studies she was asked to write an acknowledgement of country, and I thought I'd just read you a bit of it. And to quote my daughter, I will begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose lands I'm currently on in Canberra, where my parents live, where I was born, where I grew up, and where I feel like a local. Canberra means meeting place in the local Ngunnawal language. Ngunnawal and Ngambri people continue to live and travel through the Canberra region, maintaining culture by connecting to land and through artistic expression. For thousands of years, other tribes use Canberra as a meeting place to learn their law, take it back to their own country, and manage their cultures and landscape. The Yuin people, the Gundungurru people, the Naragu people, the Wiradjuri people. I also acknowledge the Walbanga people of the Yuin Nation on whose lands my family own a bush property and built a house where I often stay and feel a deep connection to place. I profoundly respect First Nations people's sovereignty, spirituality and deep connection to country, and acknowledge my limited understanding of this as a non-Indigenous person. I thank them for caring for the land for over 65,000 years, for all time since created by creator spirits. So that's just a small part of her acknowledgement of country, but I thought it is beautiful in its own right, but also goes perfectly with Tricia Dixon's Spirit of the Garden, which has been published by the National Library. Here's a couple of quotes from Tricia's beautiful book. I've never seen an unhappy looking gardener. We become most alive in the presence of beauty. It is a quality not simply relevant, but essential to our being. Beauty, the beauty of the natural world, leads us to a higher state. Reading this book, taking in Tricia's beautiful photographs, which I'm so glad to see showcased here, reading extracts from poets and other gardening writers, philosophers, landscape architects, fires up our imagination, perhaps imagination that awakens the wildness of the heart. There's a lot in this book, and there's so much to talk about. So joining Tricia is Fleur Flanery, who last month presented the conference the Adaptability of Landscapes, discussing all the connections between landscapes, garden and ecology. Renowned Australian architect Philip Cox, who 40 years ago bought a beautiful bush property at Murra on the Bermagui coast, where natural bush is the defining element. And Max Bourke. For over 40 years, Max has helped rehabilitate and care for 30 hectares of coastal New South Wales by establishing a private arboretum of Australian plants. And Max is the immediate past president of the Friends of the Australian National Botanic Gardens. And Tricia Dixon is just one of our great garden writers, garden enthusiasts, and please welcome them all tonight. Tricia, congratulations on this beautiful book. You've written many books on gardening, but this one is different. Tell me about the catalyst for the Spirit of the Garden. What is it?
Well, perhaps it was kind of fortunate that one of the first books I did, I wanted it to be called The Essence of the Garden, because unlike all you good gardeners out there that actually put things in at the right time of year, you prune things correctly and you weed things and you rake and you do all of that, I kind of like to live life, and I love beauty, and I really love to also just be in tune with where I am. So I have an old house in a beautiful, older, ancient landscape. So whatever I do, I want to be subliminal to that, because that's so overpoweringly, amazingly beautiful, the landscape. And so I don't want to be kind of just almost competing with it. And so for me, always, when I leave a garden, it is about the feel that it leaves me with. And it's probably different to Max, who's a scientist, and he'll be looking at what botanic species are there and know all the Latin names and everything. And it might be that, Philip, you'll be looking at the architecture. You're such a, being a landscape architect, you're really kind of cutting edge design, and everything. So we all garden differently, but for me, it's just like meeting a person. If they have a beautiful character, a warm heart, and a beautiful smile, they'll leave me with such a fabulous feeling. A garden that's just right and it really fits with its architecture, its surrounds, its landscape, it kind of honours where it is. To me, that really makes me feel good. And it doesn't have to be immaculate, it doesn't have to have amazing botanic species, it just really needs to be a fit for where it is. And so as much as I'd love a place at the beach, I'd love to have all native species. I've got an old place that was an old European garden, and so I'm kind of honouring that.
I gave the acknowledgement of country, and then you do quite a deep acknowledgement of country and of Indigenous custodianship. What have you learnt by reading the country through the eyes and experience of local Indigenous people?
Well, I just feel such incredible humility, like incredibly small, just tiny for my little time that I've been at this property. But as you say, 65,000 years there have been people there, so really whatever I do is just a blink in time. And so it's really just to enter anything with humility and just with gratefulness and with grace for being there, and just kind of honouring what's there, and even honouring, you know, the Europeans that have been there for that nearly 190 years as well, because they're part of the history as well. So really what I do, as long as I don't kind of muck it up too much, I just try and kind of just keep it...
if we could turn our phones to silence, it'd be terrific. Just to bring in our other panellists, Philip, it's taken quite some time for many non-Indigenous Australians to get their eye in about our own landscape. For a long time, the trend was to English country gardens.
Well, I think that that's sort of arisen, you know, with our Anglo-Saxon foundation, you know, the nostalgia of the English garden. The people wanted to remember England, they wanted to remember the countryside. They felt dislocated from the greenness of the English countryside. And the early writings, you know, clearly show that the greyness and the olive green colours and the ochres of the Australian landscape were very, very alien. It was really Elizabeth MacArthur was one of the first ones who saw the Australian landscape in terms of the English landscape. She just said, you know, the Australian landscape reminds me of an English park, but the colours are different, the forms are different, the textures are different. But she looked at it in the same way that Capability Brown or Repton or William Kent looked at it. They saw it as a pastoral parkland. And somehow that image dissipated after a while. You know, it was rape and pillage of the landscape as land clearing took place. And it was never done with the sensitivity of creating that great English tradition of landscape, that the great parklands of England. So we've got a very, very haphazard landscape resulting from the attitude. But then, you know, that nostalgia's never disappeared, and I see parts of New South Wales, and particularly Victoria, which are very, very English. You know, everything that just reminds me of a European landscape, and I find that, you know, it's very interesting, and I get, you know, worked up about it too. I love it, but I hate it at the same time. I think, you know, how disappointing it is that we don't really acknowledge the wonderful material that we've got to work with in landscape. And why don't we see it in the broader sense of how landscape manifests itself on a macro scale that is very much a part of our psyche.
Max, what do you think? Has it taken a while to get our eye in, to love what is here in this ancient?
I guess in the early 60s I read a book by Bernard Smith, who wrote European Vision in the South Pacific, and that really changed my view. I mean, Bernard doesn't say this, or didn't say this in the book, but I don't expect, I mean, if you can set apart, it's very hard to set apart the invasion of Australia, but if you imagine that the people who came, of course they'd bring what Philip said. How could you not bring your own intellectual baggage with you to look at the landscape through English/European eyes? I mean, you've got to do that if you're an invader. And so I think it's the worst thing was that it took us probably 150 and maybe 200 years to begin to look and think like Australians about. I mean, I'm not sure that 100% of people do so now, but I think a lot do, and the points Philip's making, people pick up and do actually look with Australian eyes more than they did.
Fleur, what do you think?
Many things.
But on
this topic.
Perhaps
I think something Margot Neal said at the Australian Landscape Conference really has hung firm in my head, is there is no nature without culture. And so if you think about how you all imagine nature, it comes from your, from your backgrounds, from what you've taught, from pictures that you had at school. And I just think one thing about Canberra, having managed the parks and gardens here, there's that lovely limestone avenue, and there's a memorial dedicated not far from you, Alex, that was dedicated by the Australian Natives Association.
Yes.
Yep. And I've often driven past that thinking about it was planted under a works program, so people out of the Depression wanting to have something symbolic in Canberra where they put themselves into it, and they picked a whole range of different native trees, and some have done better than others. But it did stand at the time in sharp contrast to Northbourne Avenue, which had European plantings. And so our nature is a social construct, and our nurseries, it's difficult to go and just suddenly go, wow, I'm going to have this sense of Australia if your nature isn't that. So it really comes back to what you've learnt, how you perceive, what you find is beautiful.
Did you want to come in here, Tricia?
Well, I think it's really interesting too, because there has been for so long, is there an Australian garden? And I know, Philip, your place was actually farmland and you've made it into that, but next to the house you've got all your English plants and everything. And it's just like in your library there, you would have many, many books from overseas as well, and we eat our overseas food and wine and things. So I think I can't see that we should be made to be purist if we actually do have wider tastes, and if the architecture doesn't dictate that, or perhaps what's there. So I do think we have to be a little bit flexible too with what we do.
Yeah, well, I agree. You've got to be flexible. I mean, our whole horticulture is an exotic one, really. Our legumes, our citrus, our trees, the things that we eat and all the rest of it are exotic. So, essentially a part of the landscape is going to be exotic, to the cereals that we grow. Our farming is exotic. So it's the way you deal with it, and the way you perceive the landscape, and how you design the landscape with exotics. My criticism, the barrel gardens and all the rest of it, that they are entirely imitations of English gardens, and you rarely see a eucalypt in them. They're definitely, the deciduous European trees that have been used, and it displays unlimited nostalgia in the gardens without any reference, I believe, to what is essentially an Australian landscape.
You talk about John Glover's Patterdale.
Yes.
And his, that painting, which it's bursting with flowers, European flowers. But you say it was marked a bit of a moment in terms of the history.
So John Glover, who we all know is a colonial artist, and came out in his, at 70 years of age, to actually move from England here in the early 1830s or whatever, and then bought this place way, way, way out, Patterdale, which is kind of a long way from anywhere then. And so he did actually, it's really interesting, people thought that he made the trees kind of look like oaks, but in fact in that part of the country that's how eucalypts look. But there's one really famous painting that he painted, and it's My Garden and Home, and he's got every single flower that could possibly flower out at that one time, which they couldn't possibly be, because he wanted to send that back to England to all his friends back there to say, look, I live in paradise, I haven't just gone to the other side of the earth and disappeared, I live in paradise. So that was a kind of bit of paradox as well. Yeah. But he was... Yeah,
it's interesting. I have friends who live right near there, so I know that valley really well.
Isn't it beautiful?
They live on the Nile River.
Yes.
And in fact, they didn't bother with a garden at all. They've just
landscape.
used the eucalypts that flow down to the
That's
river,
beautiful.
and in fact they're very worried about. They said we're going to lose them all in terms of climate change.
Yeah,
they're going to die. But I just thought it was an incredible contrast because they live right next door, and they went, "No, we don't garden."
But see, that's coming of age, because that was, when I grew up, it was everyone totally just kind of blocked out the landscape, and now, thank heavens, everyone embraces. And if ever I'm asked to kind of be involved in a landscape, I just said, why would you why would you wreck it by putting a garden in there? Because
Fleur, what do you think? I mean, it's given to us. Nature's given us a lot of things.
It has, and I just want to correct Trish once. She said she's never seen an unhappy gardener, and I can be an unhappy gardener because actually, in my garden in Yass, I've tried to grow plants that work in the extremes, and yet I actually gave them too much love, and half of them died. So I was a very unhappy gardener.
Tough love.
Yeah, tough love there. But one of the things I was reading, and Trish, I don't know if it's the quote out of your book, The Spirit of the Garden, or something I was reading in the lovely bookshop upstairs from George Seddon, is he was talking about gardens are not just important because they're beautiful or that they make us happy or sad. Is that, where you look at the popular areas of population in Australia and across the world, gardens play a massive part in biodiversity. And so one is perceptions of nature, but the other is pretty fundamental, that if we don't start to use these gardens to be just more broad than, something pretty that we look at, we really are losing biodiversity at leaps and bounds. And it's incumbent, I think, on all of us to try to do something in our own way, something that's not, too hard to do, but just think about what we're doing, how we're maintaining our gardens, how we're using our resources. And as Philip was saying, the things that he doesn't like about certain gardens, and I think it's just the antithesis of your work, Philip, is, yours is very original and very, bounded in sight. Whereas when you see direct copies of things, you kind of go, oh. And so it's when you're copying in a landscape that doesn't fit in. And really, Trish, when reading through your book, that's what I felt. I thought I could just imagine you pulling books off your shelves and taking in what other people have said, and just thinking about all the beautiful gardens that you go to, and just going, okay, this really gives me a sense and gives you a sense of how important they are.
But I think that there's what I loved about Trisha's book, there's a common thing of spirit of place, genius loci. What makes a garden have that quality where the spirit is uplifted or transported, by nature itself or the composition? What is this thing? And it all gets down to, the 20th century philosophers of phenomenology, of genius loci, which goes back to early Greek, for the oracle, where the Greeks found a wonderful place. The spirits were there. It was a natural place where God was there. And that tradition has been followed through, that you go into places where the spirit is there. And it's very, very hard to define, your reactions to what is that spirit that wells up in you, that transports you because of that situation. And sometimes, and what I liked about Trisha's book is that she uses a lot of vignettes of those experiences, of why things worked, in particular gardens that she's visited. And I think, Tricia, you explained that reasonably, I say reasonably well, because it's an impossible situation to describe the subconscious in people. What is that subconscious feeling that expresses itself, that brings ecstasy or bewilderment or joy or whatever in what you're looking at? And it's a very, very hard thing to explain. But I think that the vignettes that you have in the book, go a long way to revealing the nature of that experience with particular gardens. And that is what Genius Loci is all about. And it really applies to, to the revelation of a situation by putting things in a situation that suddenly reveal what is there. And it wasn't revealed before. It might be a piece of sculpture, it might be a water element, it might be a different sort of a building or whatever. I mean, the Greeks were very, very famous at putting temples in the right place, and they're beautifully romantic, elements within the landscape, and that revealed spirit of place. So I think that, this is a very, very big subject, and a very, very important subject, that we analyse why things happen, what is in our subconscious that is able to be revealed by nature and by landscape and how you develop it.
And I think that's what we're responding to. I mean, Max, did you want to consult the genius of the place in all? Is that something that has been a sort of guiding...
Well, I really love the book, and I commend all of you to buy it. It's a terrific book, because I felt I was being continuously admonished for my behaviour. and a bit of self-flagellation is good at times. And the reason Philip's touched on it in a sense there, because I, unfortunately, starting off life as being trained in science, I still find myself not looking for spirit of place. I'll go into a garden, things. Even the gardens that Philip doesn't like in Barrel, is full of camellias or something, and look at an extraordinary camellia, and what I'm really interested in is that the genetics, epigenetics, or in fact a viral thing that's causing that camellia to have an expression of 5 different colours of pink at the one time. Instead of just saying, wow, that's beautiful, I get totally carried away by the other stuff of why is that happening, or why are those lerps eating that eucalyptus tree but not eating that one that's next door to it, that... All of those sort of things bundle through my mind.
You have to apologise for that kind of knowledge. So I think we need that too.
Well, no, but Tricia gives you a good reason to not do that. I mean, I think, and that is to lie back and enjoy it in a way.
But I can totally understand where you're coming from. I can't see it through your eyes, but I have a brother who's he's a professor, a scientist, and we're all at Spring Ponds. My daughter's here and she lives in the family property. A lot of these photos are from there, and it just resonates in this kind of lovely kind of feeling there. Anyhow, and one time we were there and my brother was there, and he's, really scientific and really, he's just a beautiful, beautiful person, but he sees things very objectively and quantifies things. And so then there were some people staying there, some friends. Anyhow, there was one who had come in and seen a beautiful big landscape plan that I'd had drawn up by someone for my mother before she left the property, and it was this beautiful plan. And I found out that he was actually Richard Stutchbury, and he was staying in the shearers' quarters, and I knew he was a landscape architect, that he worked with Aboriginal people, and I could just tell that he kind of would get that type of thing. And so the conversation kind of got around to, which I hate. So, Tricia, what are you doing? And everyone's standing there, my brother's there, and everyone's looking at me. So what are you doing? What book are you writing? And I'm squirming, because I hate talking about myself. I hate talking about what I'm doing, because especially to write a book about atmosphere is about the hardest thing you can do. It's like writing about air. So I just turned straight away to Richard and I said, so it's about spirit of place. What's your take on that, Richard? Which he just said straight away, of course it's what I consult when I go to a place. And I just thought, that's exactly, and it's what you've done there, Philip, so amazingly. And you have always talked about it. George Seddon, which was in that book, because he'd always talked about it too, and Dan Pearce and Thomas Doxiadis. But you, every time I've been down to your beautiful place at the Murra, it's what you talk about, and it's so tangible there, and it really resonates. And I'm sure every person that goes there, they go away seeing gardens in a different way, because I think for so long, and certainly any of us kind of my age that grew up the whole time with the Vita Sackville West, kind of the white garden and the box hedges and everything, so I don't know, it was kind of almost formulaic that, gardens had to be like that, and it's just so good that now that we're really kind of thinking a different way.
I think George sort of liberated, and particularly that book of his called The Old Country, and the great pleasure of knowing George moderately well, and I think he kind of liberated us in a way that you can actually separate the ideas of just beauty from gardens.
Did he liberate you?
Well, you can separate the idea of beauty from gardens. I mean, one of my most favourite interesting gardens is the garden that Derek Jarman created in England.
Yeah.
And it is anything but beautiful.
Exactly.
I mean, it is hugely interesting. And it's got almost no plants in it for a start. It's rocks and metal and stuff. But it's, that you can create a place that's astonishing without plants.
Don't you think that's that tapestry of person and place and their story and everything overlaying the landscape that brings up the kind of
Well, that's
feeling.
the quote that you have of Philip in your book, and I'll come to Fleur in a minute. It says, nature has provided a canvas on a broad scale to interpret, to intervene, to explore space and experience, to reveal the genius of the place. It's like a puzzle to be solved. I love that.
Well, it's very much so. Nature is there anyway. The canvas is already there for you. And so how do you treat that canvas? What do you add to that canvas in order to reveal a situation that evokes spirit of place and this feeling that you want to delight in whatever material that you're using? So I think that's very, very important, and that's so much is I think destroyed when it should be preserved, particularly in our native landscapes. We tend to not treat them with the same reverence that they should be. And thank goodness, the ecological movement and climate warming and all this has, at last, people are beginning to revere and to acknowledge and to appreciate the things that Trisha's talking about in the book. I mean, I think 20 years ago, except for George Seddon and people like that, people didn't appreciate it. Gardening was gardening, growing petunias. And, that it wasn't gardening in a more macro sense of looking at it in a more largesse situation, which Trisha's talking about in the book, which I think is fantastic.
Fleur, what are gardeners if not land artists? What do you think about that?
I am not artistic at all, I don't think. So
I beg to differ.
I will answer your question indirectly. I grew up in a rural town in Harden, or outside Harden, and I didn't move that far away. I moved to Yass. But I just had such a connection with my home and my farm that the connection to the land has always stayed with me wherever I've gone. And Alex, you started about acknowledging connection to country. And I think once you feel soil or look at farmlands, it was a shock to me in my mid-20s to discover that I lived in a modified landscape. I thought that farming was a natural landscape, but then I was rudely awakened to it being a modified landscape. And so that kind of really opened my eyes up to what are the possibilities, what does that landscape mean, what was here. My dad, as a young boy, was an egg collector, they must have done school projects. And so there was that naturalism, and I think with myself and my children, because our landscapes, our natural landscapes are diminishing and we have to generally drive to them or something, our perception of nature is different and our perception of art is different. And so I don't think gardens are only art, but I do in terms of just a beautiful place. They're places, something just to look at and go, wow, that's so beautiful. There's so much more to them. They just unfold and unfold because you look at the person that created them, you look at the landscape they're in, you look at how that person may have got plants. And I look at some of the very early gardens in Australia and think, how did they bring those plants into the country? Who was brave to bring them in? How did they trial them? And so, that's why I love gardening, and I'm sure everyone here loves gardening, because there's so many different elements that you can bring into it. You can, people say, I don't have a green thumb. You don't need to have a green thumb to garden. You kind of just need to be interested a little bit in what happens in the natural world around you. And that brings your science in, that brings your creativity in. it's just this endless thing of challenge or just sometimes reward and sometimes failure, which I think is really great.
And Tricia, you have a chapter in the book entitled Landscape and Memory, and what we grew up with as a child has such a lasting impact, doesn't it? I mean,
such a lasting impact. So I just remember as a child, my father was an adventurer, and he'd always be just off. We'd be off canoeing, camping, bushwalking. So the endless kind of dirt roads, and I'd be sitting in the back of the car, and all I can remember is just these white trunks of beautiful trees, and I never, ever, ever saw anything that wasn't beautiful. There were just these, every tree that I see, and even every drive I do now, I love to go on dirt roads, but every single tree is just so beautiful, and so it takes me 1,000 hours to get anywhere because I'm always stopping and just looking and photographing, but it just really, and I grew up clambering down the Shoalhaven Gorge, so, you know, beautiful limestone kind of country, and just a really, it's so strong within me. And so the property that I'm lucky enough to call home is in this valley, and it's just, it's in the basalt plains, which are naturally treeless, and so it's literally, but I've got all this granite country which is all full of eucalypts, and just to go walking up in there and just to look out onto it, and mossy boulders, and it's just so strong within my psyche.
yeah, and I mean, I was thinking that you and I both were lucky enough to grow up in rural Australia, and we both rode our horses to school. But I was just thinking, this is the most urbanised country in the world. Most Australians grow up in suburbs. So where does that leave us in terms of...
I think it still does that. If you just even have a bowl of water, that the birds can come in and they can feel kind of that they can get into a little grevillea or, you know, a rose bush or whatever, but just you can bring the beauty of Mother Nature into your garden. But there's almost not one single garden I've ever been to where I haven't walked to the edge and thought that the natural is more beautiful. Like they always, I think that Mother Nature no one does as beautiful a garden as Mother Nature, and so we just need to perhaps walk more in the natural bush to really get a feeling of what is right for us.
Now we're all growing up in apartments.
What I liked in your book, Trish, was the I think you quoted Kidman by saying that Australia is an arid country, and we only have moments where it's not. And your description of your own garden, in terms of drought, of looking at the lawn that is turned brown, and you're looking, you know, at the landscapes beyond, which are silver and gold and grey, and there's a relentless white sky, you know. And I think, you know, there's so much poetry in that, and so much to learn, that here we are, you know, the bushfire period of, you know, 2019-20, you know, it was a great demonstration of trying to fight the drought, which had been on the south coast here for, you know, almost 7 years, and the trees were dying and everything. We have to learn to live with these conditions and not you know, force an artificial situation that we've got to learn to appreciate. And I thought, you know, that chapter in your book where you talk about the appreciation of learning to live with drought, of learning, don't irrigate. You know, don't be stupid and irrigate. You know, you should learn how to live with nature. I think it's a lesson that we've all got to learn, that we shouldn't, you know, try the impossible when we've got the opportunity of exploring the plant material and the landscape qualities that you describe so eloquently, you know, in the book.
It's so strange because we all love to go to Central Australia. We love to think of Africa. Everyone loves to think of Provence and the Mediterranean. And I mean, both you have been to the Mediterranean with me, and we've seen Thomas Doxiadis, and we've seen amazing, totally dry climate gardens where they don't use a scrap of water. It only rains for 3 months of the year. They're some of the best gardens we've seen, aren't they? And so why do we have this fixation with green, 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 and having to have green lawns? It is absolutely...
It's nostalgia.
Yeah, it is nostalgia.
What do you think,
It's nostalgia 200 years ago.
I've put it down, this is a bit nerdy, I suppose, but I still notice that every time you see an advertisement for a trophy-type property in the coast or inland or wherever, they'll always talk about average rainfall. We still haven't got Australians to think that averages are of no interest whatsoever. Variability is what
Yeah.
Australia's rainfall is about, and it might say on average it's 650 millimetres per year. Yeah, but it's plus or minus 200 millimetres, and it's learning that variability. I know mathematics doesn't come easily to a lot of people, but variability is much more important than averages, and that was a thing that people who came to Australia, as Philip said, as early settlers, they brought their baggage of Sussex or Kent or Saxony or wherever, and somehow or other you've got to put all that aside, because the difference between Europe and Australia is massive. In Australia, where we sit on the planet means that we have massive variability, and that's what we've got to live with.
And the Australian bush is messy too. So, I used to be brought up, that's a bad farmer because there were logs lying on the ground or whatever. And then my friend David Lindemeyer said that is actually crucial for biodiversity of a whole lot of...
Great.
And I know my friend Dimity here, I won't embarrass her, but as you drive into her beautiful property, it is full of beautiful silver grey old dead trees and branches that become sculptures in themselves, and she's showcased her house to look onto this landscape, and it's just a different way of looking, but also really important in terms of biodiversity.
Which has spirit of place.
Okay. Take us there. I suppose, where did you grow up, Philip? Just by the way.
I grew up in the leafy North Shore of Sydney.
Okay. So you didn't ride your horse to school? You didn't?
No. We had a garden with poppies and stock and roses and all the rest of it. So I have to... That's where I became jaundiced, I suppose, looking at this stuff.
So how long did it take when you bought this?
Well, we had the bushland. See, the North Shore is very, very close to the bushlands of Karingi Chase and all the rest of it. So my childhood was really roaming the bushlands and the creeks and all the rest of it. And so it was very much away from the manicured, domestic gardens that my parents had. Because, they liked the bush, but they wouldn't have it, on their doorstep. You get rid of it, let's plant English trees. All of it.
And do you think a lot of people have been frightened? I remember walking once out in our bush property with a friend, and she said, "It's always frightened me."
Oh,
the bushes, she actually found it. She said, "I'm actually quite frightened."
Do you think it's May Gibbs kind of wild Banksia men?
Yeah, it is forest country and it's wombats and lyrebird. It's quite forested and it's quite enclosed.
Oh yeah, but I think having, like Philip, grown up in the lower North Shore of Sydney and escaping to little fingers of Lane Cove National Park that intrude into the suburbs, and battling with lantana and Johnson weed and all of those things that fill up those spaces where humans have slightly trashed the old residual forests. There are scary places in amongst those too. I don't think you'd be completely at home amongst them.
I can remember going, a young kid going into the bush and feeling absolute awe. You'd go in, by yourself, and you'd stand still, and suddenly the presence of the bush and the awe that the bushland had upon you, again, spirit of place. I just felt, transformed by it.
Well, that's the same feeling that I feel at Arthur Boyd's Bundanon that he gave to the nation. And if you walk up to his amphitheatre, which I'm sure you've done, and there's just this palpable feeling, it just really is such resonance of just incredible feeling. Yes, exactly as you
Fleur,
say.
what do you think in terms of, you've grown up in the bush as well?
And one of the views that I think were life-changing to me as a child, I came on an excursion to Canberra probably as an 8 or 9-year-old, and we stood at the War Memorial and looked onto Old Parliament House, and that vista I thought was the most life-changing thing. Like, I can still remember that feeling, going, wow, someone actually designed this. And my former professor, Ken Taylor, I remember him taking me there as a young student and saying, the reason that you stand at one end and then you look onto Old Parliament House, the new Parliament House, and then the hills and the sky, is because you're looking up, 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 and you look onto the horizon and anything is possible. And, you know, that's just such an amazing element to put into Australia. I mean, yes, its incarnations are from other, you know, France and other places where they've made those wonderful vistas. But it was really quite brave, I think, for, you know, a young country to do that and really to say it is the environment, it is nature that is paramount to all of us. And we, you know, if we take that thinking through to where we are now and to Trisha's book, it's just one of those things that I think we often don't take for granted, or we often, do take for granted the things that are often non-renewable, earth, sky, water. They're all our resources. And, you know, how do you explain atmosphere? Well, atmosphere is sometimes the feeling you get, but also what we can do with that. And that could be a view, or that could just be something in our own way, or looking around Canberra. I mean, Canberra, you know, the bush capital is kind of a cute term, but really some of those suburbs, when you drive around them, you know, the predominance of landscape is what makes this city the most beautiful city that you could possibly want to live in.
Speaking of spirit of place, I mean, the Griffins were deeply philosophical.
Very much so.
I mean, their whole... this city... I mean, many argue that, you know, we don't have the Griffin's proper city, but there, you know, there are elements of it in terms of linking the hills, the landscape, the
And
design.
I think that was
before she came to... after she came, I've just finished Glenda Corporal's terrific book on Marion Marion Griffin, and she was obviously totally captivated when she came. I mean, she was interested in it, but neither she or Wal had ever seen Australia, and...
the fact that she did that design from Chicago,
yeah,
you know,
but
is amazing.
Then she comes and she becomes totally and utterly captivated, like you're saying, by the Aussie bush. And indeed, in her darkest moments, when Wal's treated so badly by the FCC, that she escapes to painting and drawing and goes to Tasmania and spends time as an artist, and then actually gradually weans herself off landscape architecture and just wants to work and does work for about 10 years, basically as an artist. And that's because she fell in love with the Australian, particularly old growth forests in Tasmania that she fell in love with.
But you know, we've got a wonderful example in Canberra of spirit of place in architecture, and that's Jurgler's Parliament House. And then I discussed with Jurgler the book of Norberg Schultz's Spirit of Place, which he had read, a German philosopher. And that is the embodiment of what Parliament House is all about. And I think we are so lucky to have that building in the way it is. We could have had any other, you know, excrescence on the hill. But the way in which that unites, fits in, organic and yet not organic piece of architecture. It's almost like a Greek temple. It serves so many purposes, but it's the landscape quality that embodies Parliament House, which is part of genius loci.
And also, I think the amazing thing that was so clever with Canberra is that they made the upper canopy all eucalypts, and so if you fly over it, it just absolutely blends into the landscape. So they could have your English gardens, have your avenues of oaks if you must, but the whole upper canopy all being eucalypts just really is so clever. Such a brilliant concept.
And
Absolutely.
And it's interesting, just when you were talking about safety. There are many things that amused me when I looked after the parks and gardens in Canberra, and one was discussions about paths and hedges. But it's just interesting how people feel afraid of different things. And I often think the safer you make an environment, the less people notice things around them. So often, if you have something that's a little bit uneven to walk on, people look down or they look side to side. But if everything's all manicured, you just walk. You often don't think. And so that's why in looking at gardens, and particularly some of the interest or the images that you look, they don't just suddenly reveal. They're not just this big, woohoo, you're here, this is what it looks like, here's my lovely, beautiful lawn. You immerse yourself in them. Like there's different scales, there's, views that the designer might want you to see because that's what they love. But there's other little interesting things that if you slow down a bit and, you know, have a little bit of complexity in there, it can make it a little bit challenging, but, you know, it shows interest. And just my final point on that is I don't think gardens should always be safe places. I have one part that in my garden which has absolutely no shade. It's boiling hot. It's really hot because I grew up on a farm, and sometimes being in those paddocks mustering sheep was really, really hot. And, you know, we would kind of always hanker for the shade. And so I only ever use that part of my garden in the mornings and in the evenings. And the light is so beautiful. But in the day, it's not designed to be where you'd sit in the middle of the hot sun. And I want it to be like that so people can experience that kind of change in feeling.
And so what we saw with Thomas Doxiadis on the island of Antiparos, where there's no trees, so literally none of his landscapes had trees, and so they weren't trees for shade. Like there was one tree, I think, a little cedar or whatever, but there's just no trees. So they have other things, like might have a pergola for shade or whatever, and so literally they were just going, it looks as though it's just the natural landscape kind of crept right up to the house, but yeah, I think it's good to challenge sometimes, and you have done that in your garden so cleverly because you've used really drought-hardy plants. You don't really water.
No, I mean, we water for establishment. The other thing about my garden is there's lots of snakes in it, and not pet snakes. They actually do almost bite you. But again, you know, there's lizards, there's so many birds. I had someone out doing a bird study the other day, and they were like, wow, why have you got so many birds here? You shouldn't have these types of birds. And it's all shrubs, it's, you know, mixed planting and things. And, you know, you can't obviously replicate that in an urban area. But I do think, you know, there's ways that we can challenge our governments to be a little bit more sensitive, stop these kind of endless eat streets that, you know, are just places to attract people, and try to get some more resources and more thought into our parklands where we actually, you know, Canberra's got so many beautiful parks, but really get some more biodiversity in there and get some more interest.
Gee, I can, you know, having hosted Chief Minister Talkback for all those years, I was just in South Fremantle actually and walked along this street where one of the trees had grown right over the footpath and you went through a tunnel.
They're lovely.
It was just absolutely beautiful. Yeah. But I thought, ooh, Chief Minister Talkback in Canberra, they'd have that chopped back to the fence line immediately. Yeah. So,
and we just hear of the Victorian government, you know, having an amazing project linking up all their national institutions through vegetation, not through these kind of sign, go that way, and just thinking about ways that we can look at our city a little bit differently.
Now, Adam, are we able to do questions tonight? We'll get a microphone. Would you like to ask questions? We can keep going here, but put up your hand if you would love to ask a question of anyone on the panel.
Really, I wanted it always as a forum just for, you know, for just good discussion. So I'd love any remarks, comments, questions, anything, because we're not here just to talk at you. It just would be lovely.
Put your hand up and I'll make space for you if you would like to do that. Tricia, I'd also like to mention too, this book is, there's so many things about this book, but as someone who hasn't read a lot of garden writers, I thought, oh, here it is. You referenced so many. I thought if I wrote them all down, I wrote down the philosophers and I thought, I'm probably set. You know, it's a good start for me in terms of a library. You did that on purpose as well?
Well, it's just that I actually love literature. I just love books so much. And so I think, how can you actually write a whole book on atmosphere? So literally I want to draw on the brain's trust of all the fabulous people around the world, you know, that really could say it much better than I could.
I've got a lot of reading in front of me. I think we have a question here. So, yes, thank you so much.
It's been a great conversation, so thanks very much for that. And the idea of spirit I find very, very interesting. And what I also find interesting is that I don't know how many, it must be almost 100 years ago that Edna Walling discovered that spirit in Australian plants, in the Australian bush. And it's just taken us so long to come around to her way of thinking. I mean, she was a real trailblazer and really just went out on her own to try to create that spirit, which is fascinating. I had a
So
be
is
interested.
that the question, why is it taken? Edna
Why?
Walling
Yeah. Well, why is it
and
taken?
Trisha's done a lot of work, yeah.
Yeah, so I've just spent my whole life researching her, and really I can see that she changed the face of Australian gardening, because in the 1920s, when she kind of burst on the scene, literally gardens were there to look at me gardens, and they had maps of Australia in petunias and gerberas, you know, in the front lawn, and everyone had to walk past and say how beautiful. But she wanted gardens to be places that you actually lived in and enjoyed. And she said the nicest person she ever met was the person who said she just wanted to grow landscape. So it was always about borrowed landscape. Even in the tiniest little town gardens, there'd be kind of areas to explore. And she never had, even in a big garden, you'd never have the pergola right there, so you saw it straight away. You'd actually have to walk down this way and down there. Then you might find a hazelnut walk right at the end of the thing, you know, at the end of the garden. But she just did really change the way we kind of looked at gardens as just kind of show places to just relax and be in.
The other person who's forgotten is Rex Hazelwood in New South Wales, who advocated the growing of eucalypts with various councils and things like that. I think he most probably had just as much influence as Edna, but forgotten today. I don't think.
I think why Edna had the influence is that she wrote for 30 years in Australian Home Beautiful, so every month, all those books, and then literally her photography was really as good as Max Dupain and Casno. Like, it was that really atmospheric, beautiful. She absolutely eschewed colour photography. It was all black and white. It was just really beautiful. So those books haven't aged. The philosophy of not watering, it was so far advanced, and not pulling down all the gum trees, and you know, really honouring our natural beauty.
But I love going to Cruden and saying to Elizabeth Murdoch, Edna Walling did a magnificent driveway of Citriodora. She said, indeed, there's nothing to do with Edna Walling. I planted all those.
What does it mean to you to have your garden now on the South Coast? I mean, if we're talking about spirit and all this airy-fairy...
So it's a place for me to enjoy and other people to enjoy, and you know, it's there for everybody. Yeah. So,
on a daily basis, you...
Not really, because I don't go there on a daily basis. No, it's been... I mean, my work has been big buildings and all the rest of it, and to break the scale of doing stadias and all the rest of it, and work in China and all over the place. To go down to the South Coast is peace. You know, it's communing again with nature, which is so important in anyone's psyche. I think, you know, the therapy is in nature. I really do, and I think therapy is in gardening. It's well known that people who have neurological problems and all the rest of it get relief from being in the garden. Being, you know, with hospitals and things like that, having gardens so people can communicate with them is highly important. So,
but I think a big thing you've done there too is, okay, you're, you know, world-renowned architect, and you've done huge big buildings everywhere, but you've absolutely sublimated that whole thing to very, very less is more architecture there, which so sits in that landscape. So you're not trying to impose your whole, you know, will on that. You've really actually... you've done that very...
Trisha's been very kind.
No, it's just extraordinary. There isn't another place, really. It's extraordinary how you've done that. And
thank you.
But one other thing, Philip, I thought was very interesting, and you might know this, when you go on a garden tour, you see the garden as is, and what you don't see is often the 10 or however many years in the development. And I think you and some friends bought that land, and it was a degraded farm.
Yeah.
And so... what people might see when they're there is, oh wow, you're so lucky you've got this great forest and you've got all these things, but it wasn't like that at all. And that whole transformation...
We had to replant a great deal of it, because it had been turned from the 1840s. It was felled, it was used for agriculture, and it took 100 years of failed agriculture to finally people gave up. And we were lucky enough to buy it, and then it was the extreme task of rehabilitating it, replanting, you know, the coastlines and things like that to get it back into shape again.
But didn't someone say when you bought it, oh, you've got a pup there, boy?
When we bought it at the auction at Bega, It was owned by the Catholic Church and the Darcy family, and they put it up for auction. And through the National Trust, I was warned that this property was coming up for sale. Anyway, it went for ridiculously low price, and I was a bidder, and a couple of the farmers came over and said, "You really bought a pup there, mate, it'll grow nothing." And I said, "Well, I'm not intending to grow anything really."
Landscape.
So that it shows you that a lot of our, landscape has been failed agriculture, and it should be restored back to forest and other uses that we appreciate.
And just on Black Mountain, that was a whole reforestation project. Like when you look around Canberra, there was what I'd call an industrial scale of planting done in the early 1900s or 1920s, where they had these massive replanting programs to revegetate the hills, which was just, it's been an amazing insight from these kind of barren hills to have those beautiful blue and black hills.
Now, I'm going to put in a word for Dick Clough of NCDC. When he was working with Sir John Overall here, he was the landscape architect with the NCDC for Canberra. But he is one who did most to create the natural landscapes of Canberra. And I think that, again, we should be acknowledging him for the great work. I mean, he suffered people like Dame Sylvia Crow doing little pieces of garden in there and all the rest of it. But he saw it on the macro scale, which Griffin saw as well, which was very important, and that's your legacy here.
Max, did you have a take-home message for us tonight?
Oh, only a quick addition to the Unhappy Gardeners scheme. 4 days ago, if you'd have seen me, Tricia, or to put some more bones on that quote, I was the unhappiest gardener in Canberra. I had walked out in the morning and forgotten. Actually, I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning and thought, no, it's too cold to go out. But I'd forgotten to put the cover on the veggie pod overnight. And in my veggie pod, I had 20 of the most beautiful young seedlings of a very rare eucalypt that I was growing. And the possums had got in and browsed them all off. Some of them might recover, and smashed all the pots and I thought, why do I do this?
Well,
so there are unhappy gardeners.
There is always the great possum swap that goes on in Canberra, as we know. I won't go any further on that one, but we all know what I'm talking about.
There's quite a funny card, actually, in the bookshop that has something about gardenings, and the punchline is, and ask a man, someone will be happy if you plant this, do this, and then ask a man to dig a hole for you.
Look, on that note, thank you. Look, beautiful audience on a Monday night. Thank you so much. This is an extraordinary book, Tricia Dixon's beautiful book. Thank you to Tricia, to Fleur Flanery, to Philip Cox Max Bourke for this lovely conversation. I always say this, buy multiple copies of Tricia's book. Take a copy instead of a bottle of wine to your next gathering. Your friends will thank you, and it will absolutely nurture their spirits in such a lovely way. But thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thank you to Alex.